I'm Ben Rich. I'm the Chief Executive of Radix Big Tent. That clumsy name is the result of the merger of our two predecessors, unsurprisingly called Radix and Big Tent. Radix, a traditional think tank focused on system change, and the Big Tent, which was literally a big tent. We used to hope that people would see us as a political Glastonbury. And what they too share in common was being a space for people, sometimes outside the Westminster bubble, to discuss serious political ideas and hopefully help to shape the broader political discussion. So thank you for joining us for that. Tonight, our session is chaired by Vicky Pryce, who, as many of you know, is our chair of fellows. And I am delighted to announce, as of last week, has taken over as the chair of Radix Big Tent. And hopefully, on those hundreds of media interviews that she seems to be doing a week, she'll now be introduced. But in that way, we'll be leaning on all those broadcasters to make certain they include her most important and eminent of titles.
Of course.
So, Vicky, thank you very much. And Vicky will introduce Philip herself. Just by way of housekeeping, for those that are joining us a little late, please feel free to keep your videos on or off, whichever you prefer, but please remain muted. Vicky will kick off the conversation. Feel free throughout to join the chat. Vicky will throw questions that you post in the chat and comments that you post in the chat at Philip. And if, as we get further through, may well even invite you to come and join the discussions if that goes with the flow of the conversation. So please do use the chat. Please, if you want to contribute to Radix Big Tent, you'll also see an opportunity to do that. And I imagine we may give you an opportunity to purchase Philip's book. So look for reminders on the chat there. But with that, really, really interested. I was just saying to Philip that my very first job was working as the Liberal Democrats' Northern Ireland researcher. And I used to enjoy the story John Alderdice used to say about the Jewish man walking down the street who's grabbed from behind, and the man turns him round and says, "Are you a Catholic or a Protestant?" And the man looks at him. Sorry, I tell this joke because I'm Jewish. And the man looks at him and says, "No, I'm Jewish." And he walks on a few minutes, and the man comes back and grabs him again, spins him around, and says, "But are you a Catholic Jew or a Protestant Jew?" And so, with that totally irrelevant and unhelpful story, I'll hand over to you, Vicky.
Thank you very much. And just to say, I'm delighted to have become chair of Radix Big Tent. Thank you very much for that. But also, I'm delighted to be introducing Philip, who I've known for quite some time. I mean, I did not actually know that he's half Irish until I read the book and also had discussions about this. So that is, of course, because I'm a useless foreigner and I'm Greek. I didn't quite realize that he must be half Irish. And of course, I've known him as an award-winning journalist. He's contributing editor of the Financial Times, has had very senior editorial positions before, written quite a lot of books. But this one is really quite interesting. I'm going to wave it around. So in case you all have not seen it, which is These Divided Isles, and I also went to the odd presentation that he has made, and I found it sort of quite extraordinary. I've learned huge amounts. And again, sort of, since I mentioned the foreignness of me, I'm Greek born, as I'm sure everyone knows. And we had a civil war straight after the Second World War in Greece. And of course, we had dictatorship at various stages, including when I was growing up. And so when I came here, it was actually quite a shock to realize that there were all these troubles going on here in the UK, sort of bombs going off various stages. And the whole thing wasn't sorted out until a few decades after I came here. And for me, it was a bit of a puzzle what exactly was going on. And obviously, I've learned a certain amount, but this book has been really illuminating. So I was hoping to turn to you briefly, Philip, to just give us maybe a summary of the way you looked at it. And also, because we will discuss the end, optimism or otherwise in terms of looking forward. So things are so much better now than they were, but there's still lots of problems internationally, of course, geopolitics, Trump, and all that. But I'm sure we'll cover all that in a little while as well. So Philip, really delighted. Over to you, maybe, to just talk to us about the book.
Look, thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Ben. Thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be joining you. To start with the book, I mean, by way of sort of background, as you mentioned, I've always regarded myself as Irish as well as British. Although I was born and raised, as it were, in London, I spent a lot of my childhood every summer until I was, I don't know, 15 or 16, in the wild west of Ireland in County Mayo at my grandparents' home, and we basically decamped each summer there. And so in a sense, and often at Christmas and Easter as well. So a lot of my formative years were shaped not by the sort of grime and busyness of London, but by the mountains and rivers of Mayo. And so I've felt.
Sorry, for Dennis, could you mute your phone? Yes, he has.
And I was lucky enough to get myself an Irish passport long before Brexit, decades before Brexit. So that's the sort of personal. The professional comes in two parts. As a political journalist at the Financial Times, I covered the troubles in Northern Ireland. And as you said, Vicky, it's extraordinary to think only 30 years ago, there were 30,000 British troops on the streets in Northern Ireland, trying to hold down what was effectively a sort of low-level civil war. And it's sort of extraordinary to think that in the 1980s, and bombings on the mainland, and every time one saw a parcel left, left to one side in a shop or a rail station, one had to go and sort of tell the police and things. So that's one part of the profession. I met a lot of the people involved in trying to find peace, including both in Northern Ireland and also in Dublin, as well as obviously at Westminster and in London. And the third reason is I'm writing a sort of, I hope, what will be a series of books about Britain's relationships with other countries during the 20th century. And this is the second in what I hope will become a series. So it's personal as well as sort of, as I say, as professional. But it's, such an intriguing story. If one looks at the relationship between Britain and Ireland, it's characterized by two things. The most obvious is enmity, and understandably so. The British occupied Ireland from the 12th century until a partition in 1921, and did so with a peculiar cruelty in many respects, in terms of the way it put down the regular, frequent uprisings. One of the things it learned during that long period in Ireland is that you could conquer Ireland, but then some generation later you would have to reconquer it, because Ireland didn't like being conquered. But also in the neglect, for example, that Britain showed during the Great Famine of the 1840s, when 1 million Irish people died of hunger and another million left, mostly for the United States. So I wanted to, but that's one side of the story, and that side of the story has deep grievance on the Irish side, and I would say arrogance and indifference on the British side. But there's another side of the story, which is this sort of curious intimacy and emotional attachment. And it's the story of the two peoples, because even as, what Irish nationalists would call the sort of oppression continued, lots of Irish people came to Britain, made their lives here, had their families here, and became part of our British society. And I suppose, my mother was one of those. She came over in the late 1940s. And so there was a sort of intimacy and a friendliness. And one of the things that always struck me in recent years was that there was a chap called Richard Moore, who recently stood down as head of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 as it's popularly known. And his grandfather, which he was appointed in 2020, and in 1920, his grandfather, who went by the name of Jack Buckley, was fighting British soldiers in County Cork as one of De Valera's brigade of, as it was in British terms then, of sort of rebels and terrorists and revolutionaries. And yet when Richard became head of MI6, no one blinked at the thought that, he came from this family that, a couple of 3 generations earlier had been fighting the British as they were then called terrorists. So there is that, and there is an affinity between the peoples, and there are complexities and contradictions. I mean, it's well known, for example, that the Irish refused to join the war against Hitler, but not so well known that even so, 40,000 Irish young men came and joined the British Army anyway to be part of that fight. And the armaments factories in Britain were kept going largely because of a big influx of Irish labor. So what I wanted to try and do was to sort of untangle some of the complexity. And my starting point is partition, the creation of the Free State, which became the Republic, and then the 6 counties of Ulster, which became Northern Ireland, and look back over the 100 years to see what we could learn from that, because, as we all know, there is a chapter still to be written. I mean, a lot of people would say, and I would agree, that it's more plausible now to envisage a united Ireland than any time during the last 100 years. It's not quite as easy to see how you get there and create not just a united Ireland, but a successful united Ireland that's peaceful and prosperous, and that accommodates 800,000 people, it would be, roughly speaking, who in this united Ireland would say, well, actually, they regard themselves as British. So what I tried to do is pull out some of the threads which shine a little bit of light on how, if you're talking about united Ireland and you're aiming for it, or how, if you want to keep the status quo, what we might learn from that really troubled history. Because as I say, in the middle of it, we had this terrible period of 30 years of people, being killed on the streets of not just of Belfast and Derry, but of, London and Manchester and Birmingham.
Well, can I just take that a little bit further? Because yes, it was only a few decades ago, and it's extraordinary what happened. And we can talk a little bit about the Good Friday Agreement and Jonathan Powell's role and so on. But it's interesting how you can then, the divisions had been and are, just thinking about Ben's joke as well, Ben Richards' joke, religious. Whereas again, thinking back to my country, they were more ideological, communism versus Rhodes. And it's interesting to think of particular people who are sort of prominent now. So Chris Whitty, for example, who was a chief medical officer for England. So his father was killed by November 13, which was a sort of a communist organization in Greece only a few decades ago, as well. Yeah. But we moved on, and it's funny how people do. You can move on, but as you were suggesting, there is still an issue there, possibly in terms of what happens next, and religion matters. And I think what you have in your book is something about demographics and how that has actually changed. So the sort of Catholic numbers in Northern Ireland have increased quite significantly, if I understand this correctly. So and that perhaps is one way in which you can, or perhaps it is the other way around, and I haven't quite understood it. Just explain the demographics.
Okay. Well, the demographics were such that Northern Ireland was established not because the British wanted to hold on to a bit of Ireland, out of spite or whatever. The British had decided by 1921 that they couldn't defeat the Irish Rebellion. But they had in the 6th, or in Ulster, a large number of Protestant unionists, as it were, who refused to accept the idea that they would that their politics would shift from Westminster to Dublin in a united Ireland because they felt that they would be submerged, as you pointed out, by Catholics. And Catholicism and nationalism by then had become as one as Protestant and Unionism. But it wasn't always so. If you look back to some of the great heroes of the Irish rebellions, like Wolfe Tone or Parnell, in fact, the parliamentary advocate of Home Rule, they were actually Anglo-Irish and they were Protestants. But the line was pretty sharply drawn by 1920. So the British wanted to get out, but they knew that there'd be civil war between the Unionists and Nationalists if they got out. So if you like, for them, giving the Unionists 6 counties, 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster, it's not Ulster, it's 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster, was a way of keeping the Unionists subdued and while giving the Irish at least 3/4 perhaps of what they wanted. That division, though, was then set in stone. I mean, this is the big problem. If you roll forward to the Troubles, is that Ireland became more Catholic, more conservative, more inward-looking, less tolerant of Protestantism, and the Northern Ireland became less tolerant of nationalism and Catholics. It became very much, and that was because the state had a 2/3 built-in majority. There were 2/3 of the voters in Northern Ireland were Protestants, and that, by and large, a few might have voted for, but by and large, that meant a 2/3 built-in majority. And the assumption of the Unionists was that would last forever. In fact, now there isn't a Catholic majority now, but there is a Catholic plurality, as it were. So I think if you look at the latest census, about 44% of people in Northern Ireland identify as Catholic, and about 39-40%. And that trend is continuing because of differing birth rates. So if you're for a united Ireland, you can, if you like, you could say, well, look, we'll just wait it out. And eventually we'll get to a majority. And the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the Troubles, or at least the fighting, in 98, provides for referendum in both North and South. So there is a temptation for nationalists just to say, well, a united Ireland will fall into our lap, as it were. The other big changes, of course, is that you go back to when I was going to Ireland in the 1950s and 60s. It was a very backward, agrarian. I mean, I didn't realize this as a child. I thought it was wonderful, but in broader economic and political terms, it was backward, agrarian, relatively poor. After all these people were coming to Britain because there were no jobs for them in Ireland. And so it had no attraction for people in Ulster. I mean, Ulster was the manufacturing hub, as it were, prosperous, trading part of the British trading, global trading sort of empire, or not empire, but network. Now, of course, you're in this position where the Republic of Ireland is immensely prosperous. The grip of the Catholic Church has essentially been broken, largely because of the revelations about the church's terrible abuse is during the post-war decades of young children, of mothers,
yes,
and others.
It's something which is still being discussed. I mean, absolutely reverberates and gives a lot of grief to those.
But Ireland now looks like a modern European, pretty open, part of the EU. We can come on to Brexit in a little while, an open liberal state, whereas Northern Ireland looks a more defensive, withdrawn state, and of course it lost its heavy industry during the Thatcher years of the 1980s, so it's heavily dependent on subventions from the UK Treasury. I think.
You do have some figures which suggest that it would be costing what Ireland, if it were the Republic, if it were to take over Northern Ireland, into it, something like 20 billion.
Yes, I mean
a year.
That's one calculation done by economists in Ireland, but it's the direct subvention from the UK Treasury to Ireland is something like 12 billion, and then there are other additional costs of pensions and welfare provision. So in one sense, you can say but more or less all the conditions have changed. The problem is that while the Good Friday Agreement, a triumph for Bertie Ahern, the Irish Prime Minister, and Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, and also for the Unionists and SDLP, the Northern Ireland nationalist John Hume, and for David Trimble, was that although they reached they stopped the fighting. That's what they brought peace to Northern Ireland. That's what the agreement did. It didn't bring reconciliation. So travel to Northern Ireland now and go around Belfast or Londonderry, you'll still see these walls dividing the different communities. The different communities still send their children to different schools. So we've got peace in Northern Ireland, but we haven't got reconciliation.
But Philip, there is also, of course, the question of UK or English-Irish relations, because Mike Cook, who is Irish or half Irish, completely Irish, he says in the chat that talks about the racism that existed against the Irish in England, which has I don't know, I guess has largely disappeared. But has that been something? I haven't seen a huge amount of that in your book. Or was it important in well, it must have been important in terms of getting the two sides to at least get down to talking.
I think this gets back to the complexity of the relationship. There was certainly a prejudice. I wouldn't call it racism so much as prejudice against Irish workers in Britain during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there were all these stereotypes of, the Irish were unintelligent and whatever, and they could fit only to work in bars or on construction sites. And that lasted a while, but the Irish were very good at sort of, integrating into British society. And soon enough, you had Irish doctors, Irish teachers, Irish artists. And so, I, as a child, I came across it a little bit, but not seriously. There were Irish jokes, the sort of, but even in the 60s, the racism, it was one of the things I mentioned in my book, is that when the then governments of the Tory governments and Labour governments framed the first sort of immigration laws in Britain during the 50s and 60s, they went to great pains to exclude the Irish from the restrictions they imposed on Commonwealth states from the Caribbean and Africa. So there was this sort of, as I say, there's a tension, but the intermingling of the peoples, I think, you always get some upheaval. I don't think you hear many Irish jokes now. And I mean, I sort of realized that there were these jokes about, Irish labourers coming over to work in Britain and, to build the roads. And they did build a lot of the roads and rebuild the cities after the war. But, by the end of the 1990s, Irish construction companies were advertising in Britain for British workers to go and work in Ireland because the economy was booming so much.
Yes, I mean, things have changed without any doubt, and also, of course, we've had Brexit. But before we move on, because I think Robert Sherwood wanted to ask a question too, we need to also talk about how Jonathan Powell and also Tony Blair perhaps pursued this. So it would be interesting to just have a few minutes on that. But just to explain what I was saying before, because it just occurred to me when I mentioned Chris Whitty, his father was killed in Athens, where he was military attaché at the British Embassy. So we had quite a lot of that going on still. So maybe it wasn't such a surprise what was happening in the UK at the time because of the Irish issue. as well. So I just wanted to quickly, before we open it up, talk a little bit about how we got to the point where we managed to get the Good Friday Agreement signed. You talk in the book about Jonathan Powell and believing that you had to keep on talking. And the question is, does this tell us something about all the geopolitical problems and discussions that are happening right now? Is there anything to be learned from this? But also that Tony Blair thought that getting a solution to this would improve the standing of the UK in the international stage, and that would be pretty good for growth and so on. All these things make huge amount of sense, but in order to achieve that, you need to really persevere. And I think what you're saying in the book is that there was indeed that intention. There was a strategy to continue talking and getting an, which is actually, what led to that in the being signed in the end. Yes.
I think there was a realization when Blair came in by the end of the 1990s. Well, there was a realization on the British side that they could never defeat the IRA with military force, because a few hundred IRA fighters, volunteers, whatever, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, could hold down tens of thousands of troops. There was also on the IRA side, provisional IRA side, a realization that they weren't going to drive the British out. So there was an opportunity. It might not have been taken, but it was, and it was taken because Tony Blair, with the help of people like Jonathan Powell and Bertie Ahern, who was also, like Blair, a sort of new generation politician, decided that look, once and for all, this is a conflict that belongs to history. So let's consign it to history. And they both spent a huge amount of time and energy and political diplomacy and a certain amount of chicanery employed by everyone to bring an agreement, to put an agreement in place that both, Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams and the provisional IRA could sign up to, and the unionists, and don't forget the loyalists. The unionists were represented on the battlefield, as it were, by loyalist paramilitaries who also had to be brought in. So, but if there's a message, it's that politics can sometimes work if you have determined, and in the world we're now in, I think we need to hold on to that message, because we often, I think, despair of the fact that democratic politics can't do anything, or can't seem to do anything. So politics can work, but it requires huge application and a certain amount of bravery. It wasn't, to be fair to his predecessor. I mean, Tony Blair was picking up a baton that John Major had first picked up when he came into power in 1992. And a lot of the groundwork was done by John Major, who took big political risks to do so. But Ahern also, though, Bertie Ahern brought his party around to the idea, I mean, that the Republic would have to give up its historic claim to the territory of Northern Ireland and accept, if you like, the unionist consent to a united Ireland, a unionist veto. So it won't happen until a majority of people in Northern Ireland vote for it. And that was a big leap that for the Irish. And so Ahern deserves a lot of credit as well.
No, indeed, and you do give that credit in the book. I have to say. So then finally, before we open it up, I mean, in terms of unification of the two bits, I mean, Brexit must have played a role as well in terms of making people rethink, maybe, or at least warming to the idea. We talked, of course, about the possibility of a referendum being allowed in the Good Friday Agreement. Now, what do you think the likelihood of that might be, given Brexit?
I think Brexit gave a push in two ways. One, it should have demonstrated to unionists in Northern Ireland that they no longer have in the Conservative Party is officially still called the Conservative Unionist Party. What Boris Johnson demonstrated was that it would throw over Northern Ireland in order to get the terms it wanted on Brexit. So Northern Ireland did not, loyalty to the union in the Conservative Party is minimal. It likes the support of unionist MPs in Parliament sometimes, but it's not prepared to commit itself to the union. So that's one part of the effect of Brexit. The other part, of course, is that it's created, because we left the single market and customs union, the only settlement, or the settlement that the government then accepted, was to create effectively a border, albeit a fairly sort of invisible one, in the Irish Sea, which has made trade between Britain and Northern Ireland more complicated, while trade between the North and South in Ireland remains open, and Northern Ireland remains de facto in the EU single market. Now, that would suggest that would point to, over time, more and more economic integration, more cross-border investment, trade between the two, and you beginning to see some of that. So if you believe in the sort of the theory that it's a sort of it's a long but inevitable road to, then that's part of the story. I just put one huge but in this. One of the big message I think in the book at the end is that don't think because these particular parts of the puzzle are now in place, a Irish unity on the basis of a referendum, which perhaps might give 50-odd% for unity, and 40-odd% would be a success, because it wouldn't. There has got to be an agreement, and so the lesson, two lessons in the book, I think. One, the lesson for the Irish government is that, and for nationalists, is that they have to win consent. It's not just a question of getting enough votes. It's a question of a real majority in Northern Ireland, if not being enthusiastic about a united Ireland, at least being willing to go along with it, if that's the way the vote goes. Losers' consent, you would call it. I think the lesson for the British is that we can't just forget about Northern Ireland. Whether it remains part of the United Kingdom or whether it eventually becomes part of a united Ireland, we can't, as we did for most of the 20th century, just say it's nothing to do with us. It is part of the United Kingdom. It's got to be treated properly as part of the United Kingdom.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much. There are a number of questions, and perhaps because we're talking about how do you solve the problem of the future, should it move in that direction, and also thinking about sort of compromise, but actually being also on top of it. What is happening geopolitically, of course, matters. And Mary, do you want to ask your question if you wanted to, or otherwise I can read it out myself? Mary?
I'm very happy for you to read it out.
Okay, and I think it touches a little bit on the way in which I sort of started it in many ways, which is really, so when you look at what is happening in other places, whether it's sort of Russia and Ukraine, or whether it is, of course, sort of Gaza and so on, are the lessons to be learned from the way in which we went about getting this agreement that can perhaps be replicated elsewhere?
Actually, could I interrupt there? Because that actually is, I think the British are very keen to preach the great example of peace in Northern Ireland, but that's actually not the question. The question was that I was very interested that in your opening remarks, Philip, you talked about enmity and intimacy, and it seemed to me that the very same description could apply to Russia, Ukraine in particular, and it might be that Russia, Ukraine and UK, Ireland are not such unique conflicts as we tend to treat them. There's actually a lot more in common. Whereas, you sit in London and you look at Northern Ireland, you say this is something absolutely unique. But I actually think there are a lot of parallels with Russia, Ukraine.
Oh, well, I'm very glad you you said it, because you've used it slightly differently to my interpretation. When I assumed you said it's not as unique, I thought you meant that they're not unique and therefore we can learn from each other, but maybe you mean something different. Okay, Philip.
Well, it's not unique, and there are still partitioned places, from empire that sort of overhangs from empire in other parts of the world. And think of Cyprus, for example, still partitioned, as it were, in 50 or 55 years after
yes, since 74, yes.
Yeah, Turkish invasion. So these aftershocks, if you like, of the unraveling of empire are still there elsewhere, and there are all over Europe places where there are populations which are part of one state, but while having an identity that belongs to another state. I think if there's a lesson in Ireland, one of the ways they got round that in the Good Friday Agreement was to say anyone born, and this would continue if there was United Ireland, anyone born on the island of Ireland is entitled to Irish identity, and also, if they so wish, to British identity, or turn it round, is entitled to British identity, or if they so wish, to Irish identity. So, and it's an effort to say to people that you can, and I think this is perfectly possible, because I've always regarded myself as not Irish and not British, but both. So there is a signal there to say, look, identities don't have to be exclusive. You can be, you can be Scottish and British, or you can be Irish and British, or you can be other things. I'm not so sure, Mary, that there's I'm not so sure about the parallel with Russia, Ukraine, because I think the principal problem there at the moment is that one state is looking to take territory from another state, and you didn't really have that in Ireland, because after 1921, the British had no real interest in holding on to territory in Northern Ireland. In fact, as I say in the book, several prime ministers, including Harold Wilson, considered unilaterally pulling out. So I'm not sure about that parallel.
Okay,
Thanks.
and then interesting. And then Robert Shaw had a question. I don't dare read it out in case I read it out wrongly. So, Robert, do you want to come and ask the question? There you are.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Philip. Very nice to hear from you today. So I'm interested in the antagonism that the Republic of Ireland has shown consistently towards Israel. It appears vitriolic, and one could say unfairly or fairly, that it brings back memories of the time when the nascent republic refused to join the fight against Nazism in the 30s and 40s. And I've obviously referenced the recent conflict. So whatever you think of the rights or wrongs of Israel's response to Hamas's attack, you can actually trace Ireland's diplomatic attacks on Israel to well before recent events. What's really behind this apparent obsession, and what does it tell us about the difference between the UK and Ireland in terms of international relations and how they view the world?
Are you also referencing the fact that Ireland is against Israel joining the Eurovision Song Contest?
Well, that's the most recent controversy, isn't it?
Yes.
But you've also actually, just in the past weeks as well, they're talking about renaming a park in Dublin that's named after Isaac Herzog, who was the first, who was born in Ireland, but was actually a president of Israel, the president of the state of Israel. So it might not just be at a geopolitical level; it might also be at a cultural level that there appears to be a degree of enmity, and I'd just be very interested in your take on it, Philip.
But there are also some Irish people on the call, so let's see if they have any views.
I'd start with the other way round. I'd say, I'd start by saying that the affinity between the Irish and the Palestinians is rooted in history. I mean, both the Irish have always seen the Palestinians as essentially fellow strugglers for statehood. And And if you look at Irish foreign policy, such as it's been since the creation of the Republic at the end of the 40s, it's always been about reaching out to other, quote, liberation movements or independence movements. So that, I think, is deeply embedded in the Irish psyche. I mean, I've been in Ireland a lot recently, and I was there a few weeks ago during the presidential election campaign. And there's as in Britain, there's a spectrum of opinion about Israel, about the current the Gaza conflict and how Israel behaved. I think there's pretty much among the political class universal condemnation of the way that Israel conducted its campaign against Hamas in Gaza. But then I think that's pretty much the same in Britain. If you listen to what Keir Starmer or others have said about the conduct of the Israeli campaign. On the left here, in Britain, you get anti-Zionism, which bleeds, I think, sadly, into anti-Semitism. And I think you have the same on the sort of radical left in Ireland. But if you like, part of standing up for those who want their own state is sort of part of Ireland's sort of cultural DNA since it fought to get its own state in the 1920s. So look, it's not a subject I've studied, and I haven't looked at numbers and things, but I think quite a lot of the Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil politicians feel pretty uncomfortable with the way that the campaign and the former president, some of the language used. But let's be clear: a lot of people who are pro-Israel in the sense of believing strongly that Israel has the right to a state are pretty much appalled by the way the Israeli government has behaved in the last 2 years, even given the shocking terrorist acts carried out by Hamas.
Okay, well, that's a pretty big subject, and of course, some Irish people here feel they want to add to this. It's interesting, but it's interesting though. Just going back a little bit to the book, when you talk about going and having your own holidays there every year, that you were still considered an English boy while you were there, and you and your brother. Did that? But so many of Irish had actually left, and we talk particularly about the area where you came from. There were hardly any left. They were all going back to the UK to work. So it is interesting in terms of the Irish identity as a result. I was just wondering, given that such a large part of the population, sort of moves backwards and forwards, has that sort of brought us all closer together? Is it an easier way in which you can negotiate anything? There are obviously some differences in terms of the worldview, but has that been a positive thing? Because again, thinking about Mike Cook's earlier comment, he made another one saying that earlier on, of course, it says no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, sort of thing in pubs. That used to be seen quite widely across the UK. But do you think that the way of maybe sort of integrating into the UK eventually has led to the ability to do negotiations more easily? What do you think?
I think that sort of intermingling of peoples makes it a lot easier for politicians on both sides, if they have the will to make agreements. And I think that's what's happened. And I think, the fault doesn't lie in all this, doesn't lie just with unionism. If you look at what, De Valera, the Irish always opposed partition, but once it happened, it was a convenient excuse for the Irish to build a very Catholic, very insular island. And what De Valera, who's the sort of, regarded by many still as the father of the Irish state, never accepted was that the island that he built, this rural, misogynist in many ways. I mean,
Yes.
the Irish Constitution said that the women basically said in terms, women's places in the home. This state drove millions of people out of Ireland. So
Yeah.
there's great paradox. I mean, that so. But yes, the fact that the grandson of a IRA volunteer can become head of MI6 tells you about how the intermingling of cultures and people. But I mean, it has, the prejudice hasn't gone in entirely. One of the the things I mentioned in the book is this episode during the uproar over Brexit when Boris Johnson showed his own deep prejudice when told he was going to meet Leo Varadkar. He remarked, "Well, Varadkar, why isn't he called Murphy like all the rest of them?" So so at some levels in our society, the prejudice hasn't gone. No. But generally speaking, I think it's
And for the UK, if it were to lose, if there were to be a united Ireland, what would it mean? I mean, we've already lost, pretty significantly. If you just look at our history, post Second World War, lost whatever colonies remained, and then of course with Brexit, we've become a sort of weaker country, weaker economy. Would that be? I mean, just thinking about what we said earlier, that Tony Blair considered the Good Friday Agreement, or at least getting to an end of all the strifes that we had at the time, would be good for the UK standing. Would losing Northern Ireland, or whatever, be a blow for the UK standing, you think?
I think it would depend on how.
Or would it just be great, or just be whatever it is? Yes.
I don't think the fact that Northern Ireland became part of Ireland would damage Britain, but how it became part of Ireland, and whether unity was a project in which, after the relevant votes, the British government took an active part to make sure it was successful, and that and gave assurances to the British, which would be accepted by the Irish, that you could, Britishness in Northern Ireland would be protected, and it would have to be. Then I think, a Britain that was part of a successful transfer of power, as it were, that resulted in both islands, in a way, benefiting, and both islands remain French, would be absolutely fine. But I think there is a deeper question here, which you're pointing at, is which, is the United Kingdom, in its wider sense, this sort of, which is now, this basically a politically fragmented state in a way. If you were really thinking, I don't think there'll be, I think personally, I think there probably will be a united Ireland. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And I don't think it probably should, because that won't be enough time to build, the bridges that need to be built.
Really?
But I think during that same period, we may well see a further moves towards an independent Scotland, further demands for devolution in Wales. And, we're seeing the revival on the right of English nationalism. I mean, the nationalism preached by Reform, although they're now, saying they're doing well in Scotland, it's essentially English nationalism, and equally on the Conservative Party. So, I think that, if you're looking, a bit further ahead, 20, 30 years, question mark, will the sort of political organization of the Isles, including Ireland and Britain, be the same?
Yes. So, certain amount of uncertainty there. Margaret McAvoy, you wanted to come in. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah.
And then that's it. Yeah.
Am I in? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
No, sorry. I wanted to comment earlier. I just couldn't find the button. I wanted to comment really on, I mean, I'm Irish, you can hear this, and I'm
of course.
brought up in Ireland and then left when I got my master's and went to Queen's University in Belfast. So I know a lot about the Republic, and of course know a bit about the North as well. And then came to London, where I've been for about 40 years, all my working life. So, the thing I want to comment on first actually is the racism point that somebody made earlier.
Yeah, it was Mike Cook.
Mike Cook. No, sorry, there was someone else.
Oh, right.
On the no, not racism. The hatred of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism. Sorry.
Anti-Semitism.
No, I grew up in. I mean, I don't recognize the views being put out or seeming to come across as anti-Semitism. I don't recognize that at all from where I grew up, and of course I go back regularly. And of course we had, there was always very great tolerance towards Jewish people. We didn't have very many of them, but we even had a president, Erskine Childers, who was Jewish. The thing I will say, though, is that I agree with Stephen that there's a sort of conflation, with Philip, that maybe people conflate hatred or anti-Jewish government or state of Israel, the government, with Jewish people. Because I experienced that when I came to Britain, when the IRA was actually in full flow. And when I'd meet British people, they would somehow kind of conflate me or sort of think that I was actually supporting the IRA because I was Irish, whereas I had nothing at all to do with them. I mean, would happily have sent them to all to jail or to the gallows or whatever. I mean, I didn't support violence. So I think people do tend to conflate things.
Yeah, it's been happening. It's been happening across. I mean, I have to say, when you look at the US with this Afghan person who
yes,
and then suddenly everyone
who's that nationality that is branded. So it's that sort of thing that's going on.
Thank you. I think that's right. Before Philip comments on this, Ben wanted to also ask a final question. Ben Rich.
Yeah, I wanted to know what you make of the new presidency. Is it part of what we're seeing across Europe, or is there a particular Irish dimension?
So Philip, if you can just touch on Margaret's, I don't know the extent to which you have a personal experience yourself, but also Ben's, and I think that would be probably the end, unless someone has a hugely sort of very important question they want to ask.
I mean, I think what you're seeing in Catherine Connolly is the populist left, as it were. And she, there is a huge amount of frustration. So there is a parallel with politics here and in continental Europe of a huge amount of frustration among people facing economic hardships, young people looking for housing, young people who think that the opportunities that given to their parents' generation are being denied to them. And it's being picked up, and she's, the shorthand for her in the Republic is the Jeremy Corbyn of Irish politics. So I think there is that she doesn't have as president any real power in either in domestic or foreign policy, but she does have a pulpit. She's a very smart person, and she's very politically astute, and she has a good approach. So it'll make life difficult in some respects for the Fianna Gael coalition, but I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. So why not, as it were, have a different voice? But I think her election symbolizes the fact that the disgruntlement with the sort of settlement, the social economic settlement in European countries is not just pushing people to the right, it's pushing people to the left as well.
Yes, no, that's right. I just wanted to say, before Ben concludes, that there've been other questions as well, particularly about the deindustrialization, if you like, of Northern Ireland and the impact that this is having, and all the stuff that we've just been discussing. So economics matters. After all, I would say that, being an economist. So very intertwined with the political fortunes of the president. One may happen next, but I think we probably are left with a very strong belief that, I mean, Ireland has done rather well. I mean, it's interesting when you look at its GDP, you just don't know what on earth is going on, because, of course, it suddenly looks like it's growing by 12% per quarter, and this is all because there are transfers of money from the big sort of tech and also pharma companies that seem to be somehow or other using Ireland for all sorts of reasons. So you can't quite tell what's happening, but Dublin seems to be the most expensive place to live in Europe. But anyway, so it's a sort of success story from there, and obviously, and if you look at it completely dispassionately, being part of the success story for Northern Ireland might actually make a huge sense at some point. So Philip, from my side, this is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I have learned so much that I really didn't know, and I appreciate all these issues considerably better than before. But I'm sure all our listeners do as well. And Ben, you may want to just summarize and thank everyone who put this together.
I'm certainly not attempting to summarize.
Sorry, I missed it.
And I really enjoyed that, Philip, Vicky. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
This is, whenever one talks about Ireland, Northern Ireland, it all sort of feels to me, this is my Jewish-Israeli comparison, it all depends on where you start from, doesn't it? And if you want to go back and start from the time of Abraham, you'll have one narrative, and if you want to go back to Cromwell, then you'll have another narrative. What about those Viking invaders? They caused you an awful lot of trouble, So it is really interesting, and I think we have a very bad habit in the UK these days of sort of seeing things only through the prism of the Troubles and the post-Trouble period. There is a much bigger story to tell, and I think that's very interesting. I'd love to continue the discussion. I think understanding the politics of Ireland through the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael division as well becomes fascinating, and understanding what those parties stand for today as versus 10, 15, 20 years ago. So really fascinating. I think your book looks fantastic, and I hope people will take the opportunity to buy it. Meanwhile, as demonstrated by Vicky, if you've had a good time tonight,
with all my notes in there,
no money.
As I always say, save the money from your Christmas drink. You could have much more fun with us, and just give it to Radix. If you go on our website, you'll find donate in the top corner. We don't charge for these things, but we do run brilliant webinars. And thank you so much to Philip and to Vicky for making this very much one of the series. And thank you everybody for joining us. Good night.
Thanks, Vicky.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
So well done. Thank you, Philip. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Philip. That was great. Actually, I want to copy now. Go and I've actually just finished reading The Persian on my Kindle, so I'm now on to the next one.
Okay.
I alternate between the books that I read for these. So before that, it was Vicky's book.
But it's incredibly readable. I mean, I have to say that I managed to get through quite a lot, quite quickly, and learn hugely. And all my notes are still in here, as you can see. So well done, Philip. This is brilliant. Thank you for spending.
Great. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Cheers.
So bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon, Vicky. Bye.